Hey, what's going on, guys? So in this video, I want to talk about a few concepts that would help you make more consistent profit when we are providing liquidity or we are interacting with DeFi. And if you're new to this channel, my name is Richard. I've been yield farming since about 2023. I've had a pretty good track record over time, but I've also made a ton of costly mistakes that I wish I hadn't. And this video is going to be talking about a concept that I wish I knew earlier. And we're going to be talking about like the price action of the two different assets that we are pairing inside a liquidity pool. So when we first start, there is something called a base asset and a quote asset. And you could call it like A asset, B asset too, it doesn't really matter. But for the more correct term, one asset is going to be called the base asset and the quote asset is what the asset is being priced on, right? So for example, if you're yield farming ETH to USDC, you're typically using USD as the quote asset and then ETH as the base asset. And most people are going to be looking at the ETH to USD chart, right? ETH is currently trading at $2,300. And then if we're looking at assets like ETH and BTC, a lot of times I prefer to use the larger asset as the quote asset just to make the chart look easier. And a lot of times when we are betting on these lower cap assets, we're trying to bet on the lower cap outperformance. And lower cap assets tend to be riskier compared to the larger caps, right? So a lot of times we want the base asset to outperform the quote asset. And what that is going to do over time is going to give us more quote asset at the end of the day. And in a lot of cases, we're also pairing altcoins with ETH, right? Let's say I'm yield farming Arrow. I recently entered into a new Arrow to ETH position. A lot of times I will be using ETH as the quote asset. And here's the most important part. We're going to be going over the different scenarios and how that would impact our profit and loss, right? So in the first scenario, a lot of times we are pairing ETH to USDC. And if price is going up for ETH and then USDC is going to be flat over time, right? Is this a good scenario or not? A lot of times it's a good scenario because you're going to be in a profit. Your ETH is going to be slowly converted to USDC. So this is a good thing. And this works the same way for crypto to crypto pools as well. Let's say you're pairing ETH to Bitcoin. Bitcoin is just staying flat. Let's say currently is at 81K. It doesn't move in the US dollar price. So it's staying flat and then ETH is moving up over time. Then you are going to be still making a profit if you value your LP in the BTC terms, right? Just like if you value your LP in USDC. And then if prices are flat sideways, this is still good because you're earning fees in the process. If you're just buying and holding and prices are going sideways, you're not going to make any money at all. But for yield farmers, prices moving sideways, that is a good scenario. It's not as good as the scenario where the prices are trending up because you're not going to be getting as much capital gains. And for tight ranges, prices grinding sideways is even better, right? So prices grinding sideways is good, prices going up is good. But if prices go down, and then let's say we are still thinking mainly about USDC, then this is not a good scenario. If ETH trends down over time, and I'm talking about like a longer term trend, right? Let's say over like the next 1 to 5 years, if ETH keeps trending down, then you are likely to lose money in the process. The fees you earn probably would not cover the loss that you suffer. That's why it's really important to be prioritizing asset selection when you are yield farming liquidity pools. So if prices trend down over time, that's not a great scenario. So for crypto assets paired with stables, this is a pretty easy to understand concept. But now let's take a look at crypto to crypto pools. There's a couple more scenarios that we have to think about. The first scenario is both assets move up and they move up roughly at an equal amount, right? So this is actually the best scenario for both like tight range and wide range LPs because if both assets move up roughly at the same pace, you're not going to have as much divergence loss. And if you're yield farming with tighter ranges, then it's much more likely that you're going to stay in range. And if the rate of appreciation is not the same, that's where we're going to get some divergence loss. So let's say the base asset goes up more than the quote asset. In my opinion, this is a better scenario. Because what's going to happen is you're going to end up with more quote asset compared to the base asset, right? So if I'm pairing ETH with Bitcoin, a lot of times I would prefer having more Bitcoin compared to ETH. And if I'm pairing Arrow to ETH and I'm using ETH as a quote asset, then I want to typically try to enter at the zone of support and then bet on the chart going up over time, right? Because what that happens is I'm actually getting compensated for taking more risk on arrow. And then in return, I'm getting more ETH in the process versus just maybe buying and holding ETH. In those scenarios, that is a great thing. But in this scenario where if let's say the base asset does not outperform the quote asset, what's going to happen is you're going to end up with more of the base asset, right? And this could be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your goals. Let's say I'm holding a bunch of ETH and then I'm investing into alt to ETH pair like arrow to ETH. And my goal is to actually get a bunch more ETH in return. Then I don't want this to happen a lot of times because if that happens, then I'm going to be stuck with more of the altcoins and then my LP is going to lose the ETH value. So I see it all the time. Let's say the yield farmer is starting with 10 ETH, but then their ETH value bleeds out to like 8 ETH, 7 ETH, even though the US dollar value of their LP is going up, right? Because remember, both of these assets are going up in USD value, and we're thinking about all of this in the USD terms right now. So you're technically having a US dollar profit on paper. So different tracking platforms is going to show you a US dollar profit. But if you're not tracking your LP in ETH terms or in the quote asset terms, you could actually be in a loss if you started out with those quote asset, right? So it's really important to kind of understand like these concepts when that happen. And now let's kind of flip the table and go towards the other side. So now in this scenario, the base asset goes down much more than the quote asset. And what that's going to do again is going to leave you with more of the base asset, right? Because if arrow loses value against ETH, then your ETH is going to be converted to more arrow. And then again, you're going to lose ETH value. And if it's the reverse, I think that is better because at this point in time, you're going to be gaining more ETH or more BTC if you're using that as a quote asset. And if it's going down roughly the same amount, then that's pretty good for tight range LPs. But keep in mind, you will be in a US dollar value loss. So that's not ideal, but that is still better than like maybe this scenario right here, right? So this scenario is probably the worst where a lot of the base asset is underperforming by quite a lot. And then you're stuck in with a ton of base asset that's just bleeding out in value over time. And then let's just say there's another scenario where the base asset goes up and then the quote asset goes down, right? So if ETH is trending down and then the altcoin you pick is going up against ETH, you're going to actually make an ETH profit. And I do prefer this to happen over like these other scenarios just because I could be stacking the profit from that divergence, right? For example, last year, there was a period where ETH dropped by quite a lot. And then altcoins like Pendle was actually going up in value. And then because that happened, I was able to close those positions at an ETH profit. And then when ETH recovered in US dollar value, then I could realize some of those ETH profit into US dollars. So that's not as big of a deal. But in my opinion, this is also not very good where like the base asset goes down and then quote asset goes up. And again, it depends what you pick as the base or the quote asset. But in this scenario, I'm assuming that you are trying to stack more of the quote asset and you are picking those larger caps as the quote asset, right? Because in this scenario, let's say you're pairing arrow with ETH, arrow goes down, ETH goes up. What that is going to do is it's going to have a big divergence in the arrow to ETH price. So if you pull up arrow to ETH price, the chart is going to go down. And again, if that happens and you care more about the ETH profit and loss, that is going to put you in a loss, right? And I think it's really important if you are providing liquidity to be valuing your LP based on like the ETH value too, just because you don't want to, again, start out with like, let's say 10 ETH and then eventually you're leaving with like 8 ETH. Because at the end of the day, if that happens, you might as well not take that additional risk to begin with. You might as well not do that much work to like research different tokens to find the best LPs because you're going to be ending up with like less capital than what you started out with, right? But the reason why I want to go over this is because a lot of people don't understand this and then they lose money in the market. So let's do a quick recap on like which scenarios are the best for liquidity providers. The absolute best scenario, in my opinion, is just prices trending up together because you're not going to have as much divergence loss. You're going to be making a lot of US dollar profit. And at the end of the day, you can choose to close those positions into either base or quote asset or into US dollar profit, right? And most of the time, that is what we want to do if we are pairing crypto to crypto pools. We want to try our best to find assets that are likely to trend up together in the future. If you're not bullish on ETH, for example, then it doesn't really make that much sense to be yield farming Arrow to ETH. Maybe you want to be yield farming Arrow paired with Coinbase Bitcoin instead, right? So you might want to be looking for those other opportunities, or if you're bullish on Solana, maybe you're actually yield farming Ray paired with Solana rather than like Arrow to ETH. So that's the best case scenario. And in my opinion, this is also good if base asset outperforms the quote asset. That is typically what we are trying to do with altcoins because we are taking more risk with altcoins, right? And if at the end of the day, these altcoins don't outperform the quote asset that we choose, then it's just not a great risk and reward strategy for the longer term because it doesn't make sense at all if you're taking risk, but then you're not getting compensated for the risk that you're taking. And of course, sometimes when you buy altcoins, they do underperform. And this is the scenario here. And it also depends on what you're deploying. But if you're deploying US dollar, then that is still fine. Let's say I'm buying Arrow and I'm buying ETH, but then ETH went up more than Arrow. The Arrow to ETH chart would still go down, right? Because that is the relative strength chart. Arrow is losing value against ETH, but at least I'm making a US dollar profit. So in those scenarios, it's still likely that you're going to be able to close your positions in a profit, right? And these scenarios are typically not very good because if you get a big divergence loss here, and let's say Arrow underperforms ETH by quite a lot, you're actually going to be stuck with a bunch of Arrow that is going to bleed out in value, right? And then this is also the case where if Arrow goes down pretty rapidly and then ETH is moving up, you could still lose a lot of money in the process. And this scenario right here where the quote asset goes down more than the base asset, let's say Bitcoin goes down more than ETH, you're stuck with more Bitcoin. That's not ideal if you're trying to make a US dollar profit. So you would be in a red still, but at least you're stuck with more Bitcoin, right? If you're actually trying to stack more Bitcoin, then this could actually be a good thing. And sometimes it's confusing to be thinking about like all of these scenarios. So you could just use the relative strength chart as well, but you still want to be thinking about like, okay, what if like one asset drops more than the other? What would happen to my profit and loss, right? And also if prices goes down together, of course you are still making a US dollar value loss, but if you are yield farming still, at least it's still very likely that you will be in range. This is especially true if you guys are using tight ranges. A lot of times tight ranges only do well in these three scenarios where prices go down together, or prices are flat together, or prices go up together. So if you are using tight ranges, basically all of these other scenarios is very likely going to like put you out of range and you're actually going to make less profit than like the wider ranges, right? Or you could even be in a loss if you do the range chasing strategy. It doesn't even matter if prices are kind of like trending up together. So we'll swing back to that in a second. And this other scenario is when the base asset increase in value, but then the quote asset drops in price, right? As prices going down both at the same time. So this is not as bad. So in the US dollar value, this is not going to be as bad as prices trending down together. And you're going to be left with like more quote assets. So I still think that this is like an acceptable scenario because at the end of the day, if I started with like, let's say 10 ETH or like, let's say 0.1 Bitcoin, I'm going to be ending up with more Bitcoin or more ETH. So a lot of times that's my goal at the end of the day. So it's not as bad as like these other scenarios where the base asset decrease in value by a lot, right? So if you're doing a lot of the crypto to crypto pools, in my opinion, the most important thing is try your best to just pick like the base assets that are not gonna like likely decrease in value over time. And let's swing back to the tight range here. And again, the reason why tight ranges are able to do well only in these three scenarios is that you're only going to be earning fees when prices stay in range, right? And these other scenarios have some sort of price divergence. So even though prices are trending up together, but then one asset is outpacing the other, it's very likely that your tight range LP is going to get knocked out of range. That's why it's really difficult to make like a consistent profit if you're constantly using a tight range LP. and then your LP is not staying in range more than like 1 to 2 months at a time. Most people lose money just by like using tight ranges and then they're rebalancing up and down, which causes you to lock in too much impermanent loss, right? So I think that's why it's helpful to kind of think about like all of these scenarios. Of course, if prices are trending up, it's still like okay for tight ranges because at least you're left with like one or the other asset, but then you're going to be left with the underperforming asset. Because what's going to happen is, let's say you're holding ETH to Bitcoin and Bitcoin starts outperforming ETH. This is the scenario right here where ETH does not go up more than Bitcoin. And then you're going to be left with more ETH. That's still okay if ETH is going up over time, but that's not ideal if you don't want to be like knocked out of range and earn no yield in the process. And then, of course, if you are stuck with these scenarios, then it's not going to be as good. So just to do a quick recap on how to make a more consistent profit from LPing, the first is making sure that you're selecting assets that are likely to trend up in value, right? And this, again, is the most ideal scenario where prices are going up together. But a lot of times, the more realistic scenario is like prices kind of swing back and forth like between all of these scenarios, right? Maybe at first prices are trending up together, and then maybe one is trending up more than the other. Maybe sometimes they're like dropping together, and then maybe it's hopping back to one of these other scenarios. So it's important to kind of try your best to try to stay in this zone as much as possible. And then if prices are starting to trend down, or it's very likely to trend down in the future, then we want to try our best to kind of avoid that. But the worst case scenarios to think about is that the base asset just decreases in value by a lot. It's very important to avoid like the scenarios where the base assets bleed out. There has been a lot of cases where the altcoins just bleed out a ton, especially the lower caps. I do hold like some of the lower caps that ended up bleeding out much more than what I expected. And then I'm sitting in a loss in those scenarios. If I'm stuck with a lot of assets that are trending down, I try to rotate those capital into assets that are likely to trend up in the future, right? If this is temporary, then it's totally fine. If you're investing into crypto, you're going to be holding through some sort of drawdown anyway. So you want to kind of be patient and make sure that you're buying things that you are comfortable with and are likely, again, to trend up over the long term or over the whatever period that you are yield farming from. If you're yield farming with like the shorter term strategy, you can still do so. But again, this is really, really important, especially for like the shorter term LPs. If the price action does not do well in the short term, of course, it's very likely that you're going to make a loss in the process, right? Even if you are yield farming higher risk pairs and like using the higher risk strategies, you want to try to stay in this zone if possible. And for most people, if you don't want to be like constantly looking for new LPs, finding like a bunch of different assets, you want to kind of use a wider range strategy, right? Or at least if you're using tighter ranges, it has to make sense. Let's say you're using a laddering strategy, that is going to be much better than like a range chasing strategy. Because if you are chasing the range, again, you're going to be locking in a ton of impermanent loss. I've made like multiple videos talking about range chasing. It's just one of the most common way that tight range LPs lose money over time. And realistically, most pairs actually do not like just go up together in value one to one. Most pairs do trend up and down. So I think it's important, even if you are using tight ranges, to have more wide range LPs, right? And that's one of my favorite setups where I have a tighter range LP sitting in a wider range LP. That's what I call a nested setup. The reason why that setup is good is because you're still covering these scenarios where like prices have less divergence loss here, like this prices grinding sideways or prices going up together. You're still making really good profit with that. And if prices do tend to like go to these other scenarios, then you're not gonna be suffering as much versus people who are using their entire portfolio for tight range LPs. I've seen like too many people just lose money chasing the range, squeezing the range, because at the end of the day, how likely is it that the prices are just going to stay in these three scenarios where there's very little divergence loss, right? If you are yield farming even stuff like ETH to Bitcoin, of course, prices could grind sideways for a while, but at the same time, if prices start to trend, you never know when that's going to happen. And if you're fully into tight range, then that's where you could make a ton of losses in the process, or you're just stuck with like the underperforming asset. So it's really important if you don't want to kind of be left without a yield to be setting wider ranges, right? Anyways, that's the main point in this video. If you understand this concept, then you understand that a lot of times we don't want to kind of use too many tight ranges. We want to have more wide ranges. And then we want to make sure that we are yield farming assets that are, again, likely to trend up in the future rather than assets that could potentially be good in the short term, maybe is having a ton of trading volume, but at your entry point, it's more likely that the asset is going to get sold off, right? So I hope that was helpful. Let me know what you think down below, or if you have any questions, feel free to ask as well. And I did recently release a free DeFi course. Check that out in the link below. I just want to put something out that helps you get started in DeFi, again, entirely for free. So check that out below. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.